we're going to go ahead and get into the program. My name is Genevieve Jones-Wright, and I am a co-founder, along with Andrea St. Julian, of Community Advocates for Just and Moral Governance, or MOGO. I am also the executive director. I'm also the president of the Earl B. Gilliam Bar Association. Both of these organizations are one of the conveners of this wonderful conference. So before we get into the program, I'd first like to start with acknowledging all of the conveners of this conference. As you can see from the caliber of our topics, our keynote speakers and presenters in our breakout sessions, a lot of work and thought went into planning this conference. So I want to thank the Earl B. Gilliam Bar Association, Pillars of the Community, Community Advocates for Just and Moral Governance, the UC Irvine Law School Criminal Justice Clinic, Detours Mentoring Group Incorporated, San Diegans for Justice, and the Peace and Justice Law Center. You can read more about all of the sponsoring organizations on the About Us page of our website at decriminalizingneighborhoods.org. Now, what I will say is when we planned this conference, it was intentional that we bring together advocates, community organizers, academics, lawyers, community leaders, and others to discuss the policing and criminalization of neighborhoods in order to find solutions and to build strategy. And so I am so happy to see all of you here on this morning. I see Grand Rapids, Michigan in the house, Los Angeles. I don't have to say California because we know where that is. We got Tuscaloosa, Alabama in the house. We have Edmonton, Alberta, Canada in the house. So just like Sean Garcia-Lays, who you will hear from a little later today, said this is a great diversity of location. We want to encourage you all to tell more people in your communities about this conference. We have 2.5 days of wonderfulness. I'll just say wonderfulness between everything that we will be discussing and those people that we will hear from who are on the front lines of making change. I don't want to forget about Brooklyn. I don't want to miss Kansas City, San Francisco. So we have the Bay Area in the house. And of course, I have to say, San Diego is definitely in the house. And Mary, I see you here from Princeton. So I want to thank you all for coming and joining us. We absolutely have a wonderful conference in store for you. Attend all of the sessions that you can. If there are some sessions that you have to miss, we understand, but please do take advantage of everything that this conference offers and what we will do together as one community. So to ensure that you all get the most out of what this conference is all about and the benefits of this conference, Andrea St. Julian will now give you a tour of our virtual spaces and help you to navigate between them. Now, it's not going to be a tour where she's pointing out rooms, but she's going to talk to us about the spaces that we will be using throughout the weekend. And if I can just ask if you're available to join us on camera, I can tell you that it is a very different thing when you can look out and see smiling faces versus black boxes with white letters in them. So if you can come on camera, please do. Let's welcome Miss Andrea St. Julian. Andrea, for some reason we can't hear you, but you're not muted. So maybe you want to check your audio settings. All right. Okay, now you are muted. Can you try to speak again, Andrea? Okay, this is definitely your settings. We still can't hear you. Let's see if we can get some tech support to Andrea. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a person that probably really needs no introduction. And his name is Sean Garcia Lays. He is an executive director, or the executive director of the Peace and Justice Law Center, a visiting scholar at UC Irvine School of Law, and a commissioner of the Los Angeles County Probation Oversight Commission. He is a civil rights attorney who works to advance public safety and at the same time end law enforcement's counterproductive gang suppression strategies. He has successfully fought gang injunctions in LA, Orange, and Ventura counties. So I guess I should say successfully fought gang injunctions in Los Angeles, Orange, and Ventura counties. He was instrumental in reducing the number of people in the Cal Gang database from 200,000 to 60,000 and ending LAPD's participation in Cal Gang. He has testified as a gang expert in immigration court, where he has successfully helped stop deportations, and he is a frequent source for the news media regarding gang policing. He is the recipient of the 2017 Chicano Hero Award from Chicanx Unidos, I guess it would be Chicanos Unidos, and the 2018 Equal Justice Award from the ACLU of Southern California. Before becoming an attorney, Mr. Garcia Lays worked as a high school teacher in Watts and East LA as a labor organizer. And I will say that we are surely no stranger to Sean's work right here in San Diego and other parts not listed in his bio. So here to give a state of the movement is Mr. Sean Garcia Lays. So if we can welcome him. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Genevieve. You can hear me, right? Yeah, okay. So thanks everyone for joining us. When Andrea approached me about helping her organize this conference, I envisioned being in a space with a great many of you, and I immediately said yes. I know that we need this. I need this. I've learned so much over the years from talking to all of you. On the other hand, when she asked me to open the conference with the sort of state of the nation talk, state of the movement on violence reduction, I was a lot slower to accept. And the reason I hesitated is because, at least to me, these feel like particularly trying and uncertain times for those of us working in violence prevention. I think we have to begin this conference acknowledging that some of the progress we've made over the last several years has been undone. We've lost more people to community violence in the last year than we have in a good many years. And by that, I mean we've lost people both as victims and offenders. Shootings and homicides are up something like 25% nationally. That's literally thousands more people across the country who are now in prison, recovering from gunshots in hospitals, or dead, thousands more family members and friends grieving. And while I want to keep front and center the lives of the people whose bodies were there on either side of the gun those thousands of times a trigger was pulled in this last year, I also want to acknowledge the toll that it has taken on those of us at this conference. Many of us are the grieving family members and friends. But even if we were lucky enough not to have been touched so directly by community violence, this has been sometimes demoralizing, just as we're needed the most. So one of the things we're needed to do is to figure out what's going on and what we need to do to get back on track. There are some explanations being advanced that we know we can take off the table right away as being obviously false and motivated by other agendas. Some would blame criminal justice reform, but we can dismiss that explanation because criminal justice reform correlated with the prior year's decrease in homicides and community violence, and homicides are increasing in places where criminal justice reform has not taken hold. Some would blame the explosion of grassroots activism since the killing of George Floyd that has been directed at police violence. But it's not the police who are suffering the increase in homicides. I checked the latest statistics published this week, and firearms-related line-of-duty deaths are 28 so far this year compared to 27 last year. So police are not the victims of the rising homicides. Relatedly, but not so easily dismissed, are concerns about depolicing and disintegrating trust between communities and law enforcement. I've heard both police officers and gang intervention workers say they have seen police respond to criticism by reformers and abolitionists by choosing not to earnestly do their jobs. Though the one statistical study of post-Ferguson depolicing that I've read, and whose author I think is on this call right now, found that depolicing seems to have only affected traffic stops, and that might be a good thing. But still, I'm not ready to dismiss the anecdotal evidence I've heard from people working in the streets that depolicing is a real problem. And as for the erosion of trust between communities and law enforcement being a contributing factor to the rise in homicides, I think trust is also something worth considering. I've seen people struggle with whether to go to police with information that could lead to solving a murder because they don't know if they can trust police or the criminal justice system to do the right thing with that information. I think the last year's public reckoning with police violence has made people in that situation less likely to come forward. And while I've seen some police struggling to reverse that, and some reform and abolition advocates recklessly disregarding the effects of damaging trust, it seems to me that the crux of the problem with building trust is that the law enforcement community as a whole has worked tirelessly to avoid accountability, protect the old status quo, and in doing so, further destroy trust. Well, I think the reform and abolition movements need to do better at accounting for the results of their attacks on police. The only realistic solution to the lack of trust is that law enforcement must do better at accepting accountability. Trust is certainly not going to be built on silencing the criticism from people living in the very neighborhoods whose residents' trust is needed. But aside from those, the obvious, if not sole reason for the increase in violence has been COVID-19 and quarantining. Not to make light of any of these very serious issues, but I keep hearing Grandmaster Flash in my head saying, "Don't push me because I'm close to the edge." Well, this pandemic was a big push to pretty much every person on this planet, especially those close to the edge. The stress of losing jobs, of being trapped at home in dysfunctional environments, the disappearance of a sense of routine and normalcy, the changes in who is publicly present on our streets. All that has to have an impact. And then there's the disruption of the work gang intervention and street outreach workers have faced. Well, I think most interventionists and outreach workers have kept working as essential workers. There's definitely a period of time when they weren't out in the community interacting in the same way, and that had to also have had its consequences. So now the question is whether we're going to get back on track with violence reduction as everyday life gets back to normal, or whether we're actually going to get everyday life back to normal, or if we have to go through a cycle of escalations before things get better. I don't pretend to know the answers to those questions, but I trust that folks like you and gatherings like this will help us get closer, not just to answering those questions, but making sure that we get back on track. So that brings me to the part of the state of violence reduction of this talk where we talk about the successes. Despite the increase in violence, which I truly hope will turn out to be a tragic but temporary spike, politically, the tide is turning. For one thing, we are now in the post-Trump era, and that's no small thing. I just saw a picture the other day on Facebook of Aquila Sherrills meeting with President Biden in the White House. So Aquila, for those of you who don't know him, was one of the guys from Grape Street Crips who negotiated the 1992 peace treaty in Watts. He's not somebody likely to have been invited by Trump. Also on the federal side of things, one of our first breakout groups today will include a presentation on the use of gang allegations by federal immigration prosecutors. And I hope to hear that the Department of Homeland Security is already backing off from some of the worst excesses of the last 4 years. We've also had some notable successes in electing prosecutors in some large counties who are following through with campaign promises to commit to smart on crime policies and end practices that are counterproductive. We'll hear from Chesa Boudin this morning, who was elected District Attorney of San Francisco and has expressly ended his department's practice of charging gang enhancements. So we continue to see gang intervention and street outreach develop into a professional, valued part of cities' violence reduction efforts. And at the same time, we see grassroots peace activists doing amazing work without pay and often without recognition. A good many of these paid interventionists and grassroots volunteers will speak at this conference. I can also look back to 3 or 4 years ago when big data policing seemed to be advancing at a frighteningly unchecked rate. But many of the excesses of the big data movement seem to have burned themselves out. And thanks to the work of many of the people and groups that are participating in this conference, police departments around the country have been abandoning these big data experiments when they were forced to justify their experiments with evidence. And of course, there have been uncountable local campaigns and wins that deserve to be acknowledged. There have also been great advances that are more subtle and difficult to account for, but may turn out to be some of the most important. The language and ideas of everyone from smart on crime reformers to outright prison abolitionists have become mainstream, opening up the public and government to new ideas. In my home, in Los Angeles County, throughout the county government, we hear everyone adopting the language of care first, jails last. While there's still plenty of resistance to that approach, particularly among rank and file in law enforcement and in the probation department where I work, you won't hear that resistance voiced by anyone in a decision-making position, which makes progress that seemed impossibly naive a few years ago seem inevitable now. So while rewriting the law that allows for gang enhancements in California, or ending overbroad gang surveillance in New York, or creating real and lasting sanctuary laws in Chicago, are all goals that have yet to be realized, all of those seem much closer to reality now than they did 5 years ago, and that gives me hope. Now, of course, much of this progress is fragile, at least on the surface. District Attorney Boudin faces a recall, as does the recently elected progressive prosecutor in Los Angeles, George Gascon. Trump supporters and their sympathizers make up close enough to 50% of the country to make me nervous. And they and their media bullhorns work 24 hours a day to use crime and violence as an excuse to advance their own bigoted agendas. Nevertheless, while some of our progress is fragile, I have no doubt that we have also laid some very solid groundwork for long-term improvement in reducing both community violence and state violence. So that brings us to this conference at this moment. I hope that in 2 days from now, we will have made some important steps in moving from this moment of rising homicides, but also rising possibilities, towards the next moment, which I fully expect will be marked by a return to falling community violence, decreasing state violence, at least in our big cities, and ever-expanding possibilities built on successes that were built on successes. So I hope that you will have gotten to meet new people, heard stories from other neighborhoods you can bring back to yours, and made concrete plans about how to advance your work as part of a national community. So thanks for listening to me, and I welcome you all to this conference. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Sean, for that state of the movement. It is with great excitement that I followed and supported the campaign of our next speaker and today's keynote. So I consider it an honor to introduce DA Chesa Boudin and moderate the discussion where you all will engage with him through question and answers. So we will start the questions after his keynote address, but please feel free to place your questions in the chat as they come to you. We want a lively discussion, and here we have a chance to hear and learn from the head of a district attorney's office that serves as a model for prosecutor offices nationwide because of DA Boudin's willingness and sincere desire to pioneer innovative policies that work to end mass incarceration and protect people of color and low-income communities that have suffered at the hands of an unfair justice system. Chesa Boudin was elected as San Francisco's district attorney in November 2019 on a progressive platform centered on ending mass incarceration, protecting crime survivors, and addressing the root causes of crime. DA Boudin personally understands the impact of incarceration. Both of his parents were incarcerated throughout his childhood, and his father is still in prison today. DA Boudin was a Rhodes Scholar and graduated from Yale Law School. He worked as a law clerk in both the United States Courts of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and the United States District Court for the Northern District of California. DA Boudin then worked as a public defender in San Francisco, where he helped lead the office's bail reform unit. Some of DA Boudin's renowned policies include eliminating bail, ending racist sentencing enhancements, discouraging the police from using racist pretextual stops, allowing victims of police violence to access victims' compensation, providing diversion opportunities for parents in the justice system, and ensuring that cases relying solely on the word of officers with documented serious misconduct are not prosecuted. So again, it is with great pleasure that I give the proverbial stage to DA Chesa Boudin. I ask that you all, please, if you can, get on camera so that he sees a sea of wonderful faces and not black boxes. DA Boudin, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's so great to have you.
Well, thank you. And it is really great to be here with you. I, of course, wish we were really all in the same room, that I could feel your energy, that I could hear your voices, and that we could all, mingle and get to know each other in between sessions. But it is really an honor. Thank you, Genevieve, for that warm and kind introduction. And of course, thank you to the Earl B. Gilliam Bar Association for hosting this event and bringing everyone together today. It really is an honor for me to be part of the conversation, to be here at the Decriminalizing Neighborhoods Conference, and to share my views and my experience on how we can do more faster to make safe, vibrant communities that we're all proud to live in and call home. I really think that we're in a critical moment in American history. As my friend Tiffany Caban likes to say, we're at an inflection point in the history of our communities and our relationships with government. And it's so essential that we bring people together, diverse voices like the ones here today, to share perspectives and different approaches on criminal justice reform and all the different angles and opportunities that exist to reimagine public safety, policing, and our communities. Now, for those who aren't familiar with me, as you just heard, I'm San Francisco District Attorney Chesa Boudin, and I want to talk today about the role of prosecutors in driving changes in the criminal justice system. To do that, I want to walk you through some of the things that I'm proud of having done just in my first 18 months in office. And I also want to make clear, the last 18 months were an extraordinarily unpredictable and challenging time for all of us at home, at work. Certainly, I couldn't have picked a more difficult time to take office and to begin trying to lead the district attorney's office towards profound changes. I know we've learned a lot of lessons in the process, and I think what we've achieved, the challenges we continue to face, the lessons learned, can really shed a lot of light on the extraordinary power of prosecutors to help drive system change in criminal justice. Before I dive into all that, let me provide a little bit of background on my path to this position, what led me to stand before all of you today. As some of you know, and as Genevieve just hinted at, my path to becoming a prosecutor was, shall we say, untraditional. Now, when I was 14 months old, my parents left me at the babysitter, and they never came back to get me. My father and mother, who were both longtime political activists, had made the terrible decision to act as getaway car drivers in an armed robbery that went terribly wrong. Although neither of my parents were personally armed, although neither one of them personally hurt anybody, 3 men were killed, including 2 police officers and a security guard. My parents' decision to participate in that crime changed the entire course of many lives, including my own. Now, I don't remember my parents getting arrested that day. I don't remember when the judge sentenced my mother to 20 years to life. She'd ultimately served 22 years. I don't remember when my dad, after a trial where he represented himself without the assistance of a lawyer, was sentenced to 75 years to life. My earliest memories are of visiting my parents, of walking through steel gates, waiting in lines at metal detectors, just to be able to see my parents, to give them a hug. And, as a child growing up, visiting my biological parents behind bars, month after month, year after year, like so many children with incarcerated parents, I blamed myself. I acted out. I had a wide range of emotional and behavioral and developmental challenges. I didn't even fully learn to read until I was 9 years old. And I also saw firsthand the horrific racial disparities that are such a defining feature of America's approach to mass incarceration. Just to give you one example, one of the things I noticed before I understood all of the different dynamics that were playing out in my life and in the jails and prisons that I was visiting, one of the things I noticed first as a child was that the lines at those prison metal detectors were almost all Black and brown women and children, right? Most people there didn't look like me. And I got to know and become friends with a lot of the other children in the prison visiting room over the years. One young man who was a couple of years ahead of me in school, his name was Lorenzo. And he was someone I really came to look up to. He was African-American. He was an immigrant from Guyana, grew up in Brooklyn. His mother was incarcerated with my mother. And we would visit on the same days a lot. And he was a star on his basketball team. He was a straight A student. He was, like I said, a couple of years older than me. So I really came to look up to him. And when I would have a meltdown, which happened more often than I'd like to admit on prison visits with my mom, sometimes she would send Lorenzo to calm me down because she knew he could talk to me in a way that would resonate, and he could relate to me in a way that would resonate. Well, over the years, eventually Lorenzo stopped visiting on the same schedule that I did, and then he stopped visiting altogether. His mom was just serving a prison sentence for drugs, a casualty of the war on drugs. And, I fell out of touch with him. This is before Facebook and email and all that stuff. So I fell out of touch with Lorenzo right around the time that I really began to excel in school, right around the time that I began to get those straight A's myself and to participate in extracurriculars and to really focus all of my energy and my emotions about having parents in prison in positive directions. And sure enough, I was able to get into Yale College. And my freshman year, as I was settling into this new world, to this world of tremendous Ivy League privilege and opportunity, I get a letter in the mail from my biological father in prison. And I open the letter, and my father tells me in this letter that he has met someone on his cell block who says he's a friend of mine, and his name is Lorenzo. My friend Lorenzo, the straight A student, the star of the basketball team, winning awards for his writing, the one who could calm me down when I was having an outburst in the prison visiting room, the one my mother told me to be more like when I was 6 and 8 and 10 years old. My friend Lorenzo was incarcerated with my father, while his mother was still incarcerated with my mother. And so I dug in and I started to reflect on, well, what were the differences in our lives? What was it that had led someone who I knew was full of potential, just the same as me and anyone else, had all the potential in the world? What was it that led him to jail while I was at Yale? And how could we as a society have helped set him up to succeed in the ways that I had succeeded? Because I knew that I had second and third chances galore. And if I hadn't had those, I certainly would not be standing here today in front of you. And maybe Lorenzo would be if he'd had those same opportunities, if he'd made the decisions he made in his life in the same context and with the same pathways to success that I'd had, right? Lorenzo's Black, I'm white. Lorenzo is immigrant, I'm native born. Lorenzo was raised by his working class grandmother as a single grandmother, while I was raised by an adoptive upper middle class white family. Those are just a few of the many differences that I began to explore. And so I dug in on white privilege and on the history of racism and criminal justice and the connection to slavery and the connection to Jim Crow and the ways in which the war on drugs served as an opportunity for this country to destroy communities, to incarcerate Black and brown fathers and mothers and tear families apart and systematically deprive our communities of the kind of investments they need to be healthy and safe and strong. And I started doing research. And I started writing papers at classes, and I went back to visit Lorenzo, and I helped get him a lawyer. And eventually, tragically, he was deported to a country he'd never known. But I'm still in touch with Lorenzo to this day. And he still gives me shout outs on social media, and I still got to celebrate him when he recently got married, and I still got to help him start a small business. And I got to realize and recognize the tremendous amount of work that we have to do as a community, as a country, if we want to be safe. And we cannot simply rely on incarceration as a response to everything that goes wrong or all of the challenges that we face. And so I dedicated myself to a career of doing this work, of fighting to end mass incarceration, of fighting to build safer communities in ways that are actually grounded in community rather than in law enforcement or grounded in more government inequities in terms of how we distribute resources. I went to law school. I wanted to fight to reform the system that had so shaped my life. And after law school, in the heyday of the era of mass incarceration in this country, a period that led the United States with just 4% of the world's population to incarcerate 25% of the world's prisoner, right? A shameful statistic, a reflection on the hypocrisy built into our self-image as the land of the free. And so after law school, I wanted to become a public defender. And I came to San Francisco and I joined the public defender's office. And I loved my work. I represented individual people who were in a moment of crisis, who were usually in the lowest point in their lives. And I witnessed time and time again the pain and the devastation that incarceration can cause, as well as the countless systemic problems embedded within our criminal legal system. I represented so many clients whose paths to incarceration stem directly from the problems they faced on the outside, things like homelessness, addiction, poverty, mental illness. I saw that what I later learned empirically, 75% of the people booked into the San Francisco County Jail are drug addicted, mentally ill, or both. And I saw how racism and classism and white supremacy impacted the majority of people who I represented at every stage of their lives, right? From housing to education, to access to healthcare, to employment, and obviously once they were arrested and prosecuted. I also saw how crime victims and survivors were treated like pieces of evidence, how they were rarely centered in the legal process in a way that was meaningful or empowering, and how all too often the best they could hope for from the so-called criminal justice system was retribution, not healing, not being made whole, not being empowered, but retributive justice. I knew that in order to stop mass incarceration, in order to reduce racial disparities that I saw every day throughout the legal system, in order, in other words, to put the word justice back in our justice system, we needed to approach crime from a very different perspective. We need to think radically, which, as my friend and mentor Angela Davis describes, means grasping things at the root. We need to look beyond the surface to determine what is driving crime in our communities and then work to solve those issues. And with that in mind, with that life experience, with that professional experience, with that vision, I decided to run for San Francisco District Attorney in 2019. Newspapers said my platform was bold. They said it was transformative. I was committed to ending mass incarceration while centering crime victims and while ensuring equal enforcement of the law. It was essentially a three-pillar campaign. It was simple. We don't need jails and prisons to be safe. We can empower crime victims in ways that but rather to enforce the law equally, no matter. Did I freeze there for a minute? Maybe I'm back. All right. Sorry, internet
You're back.
challenges. I can promise you that if I was in person in front of all of you, I would not have frozen. But here we are in 2021, still relying on, I don't know who it is, Jeff Bezos or somebody to keep us all connected here. Look, the point I'm making is that the platform I ran on in 2019 was simple, even as it was transformative. It was three fundamental promises, right? And we'll unpack what they meant in more detail in a moment. But at core, it was a campaign platform that recognized, first, we don't need to rely on jails and prisons to be safe. Second, we can center victims of crime in ways that actually heal and undo the trauma that crime has caused, instead of simply using them as justification for mass incarceration. And third, we can enforce laws equally. That means whether we're talking about police officers who break the law or corporate crooks, the power of the district attorney's office cannot simply be used to punish those who are poor and marginalized. Now, that message, that simple message of transformation and of equal enforcement of the law resonated with the people of the city and county of San Francisco. In November 2019, despite hundreds of thousands of dollars of police propaganda attacking me, despite the entire political establishment backing the more moderate traditional candidate. And with a mandate based on explicit, detailed campaign promises to rethink our antiquated and harmful approach to the criminal justice system, I was elected San Francisco District Attorney. I was sworn in January of 2020, and I had no idea how much the world and San Francisco would change in my first few months. As we're all aware, as my freezing on Zoom made us painfully aware a few moments ago, COVID-19 hit us very abruptly. It felt like overnight that the entire world changed. Everything about our society, the way we do work, the way we communicate with family and friends, it put at risk those who were already most vulnerable, the unhoused, the medically infirm, the elderly, and of course, people like my father who are still incarcerated. In the midst of the devastation of a global pandemic that so defined 2020 and continues to define 2021, in the summer of 2020, national protests erupted over the righteous rage because of a police killing of Black people, particularly the murder of George Floyd, but also Breonna Taylor and so many others whose lives were taken by the very officers entrusted and paid to keep them safe. These national tragedies catalyzed a demand from coast to coast to hold police accountable, to shift resources away from militarized police departments and into community-based solutions, to find policies that could demonstrate through systemic change that, yes, Black lives matter. And with these devastating events have come opportunities for change. As district attorney over the past 18 months, I've been able to seize that opportunity to accelerate the dramatic reforms that San Francisco elected me to implement. These efforts remind me and all of us of the power of prosecutors to effect change in the system as a whole. And also, of course, of the numerous deeply entrenched obstacles that exist to preserve the status quo, of the forces and organizations and people who will fight tooth and nail to avoid change. Now, I want to highlight a few of the ways in which I've seen firsthand that prosecutors can work to promote justice and promote the kind of criminal justice system that we are proud to have represent us and address our problems. Let me talk about our work to end mass incarceration, a brutal and racist and punitive system that undermines public safety more than it promotes it. I mentioned Tiffany Caban earlier. You know, when people asked her when she was on the campaign trail, well, what does it mean to be a progressive prosecutor? You know, and everybody wants to claim that mantle these days. Everybody wants to refer to themselves as a reformer. And I think Tiffany Caban put it really well when she said, it's not about being progressive or moderate or liberal or conservative. It's about being decarceral. It's about recognizing that we can do justice and build safety through moving away from incarceration as a primary response, through finding ways to safely decarcerate our communities. And it's true, a central mission of this movement must be to ensure that incarceration is a last resort and not a first one. You know, when the pandemic started in March of 2020, public health experts across the nation, we're all familiar with Dr. Fauci, but the person I heard from the most was the San Francisco jail medical director. And she, like so many other medical experts, warned that we needed to act quickly to decrease congested conditions, crowding. And in San Francisco's jail, she warned that if we didn't significantly cut the jail population, that it would lead to outbreaks, not only taking lives of those who were incarcerated, but also impacting and spreading the virus to the sheriff's deputies, to the medical staff, to the janitor staff, and to all those in their communities that they go home to at the end of their shifts. In other words, we were worried about exactly what we saw happen in jails and prisons across the country, from Cook County in Chicago to San Quentin across the Golden Gate Bridge in Marin, to Marion Prison in Ohio. We saw time and time again that jails and prisons create the perfect conditions for the spread of a deadly virus. We saw that if correctional officers and leaders of criminal justice policymaking didn't take the steps to reduce crowding, to increase opportunities for social distancing and for good hygiene and for access to medical care, that jails and prisons became the primary vectors for the spread of the disease to entire cities and communities beyond. Together with our justice stakeholders like pretrial diversion, the public defender, probation, and others, we followed science. We listened to science. We looked at each individual person who was in jail, and we worked to determine if they really had to stay there in the context of this global pandemic. In some instances, we delayed filing criminal charges in nonviolent cases, and we recognized that there was no public safety need for incarceration in the context of this pandemic. We also found people who were serving a sentence and identified those who could be released early. We found in this process of going over the jail list every single day, we found some people who probably never should have been in jail in the first place. We found, for example, a woman with no criminal history who was incarcerated, serving time on a misdemeanor conviction, her first ever conviction, who, like 75% of the people in our county jail, suffer from drug addiction or mental illness or both. And the jail medical staff told us that she was pregnant and her pregnancy was high risk. Now, you tell me, does public safety benefit from keeping a young woman with no history of violence, with a history of addiction, who's got a high-risk pregnancy in a jail during a global pandemic? Or does public safety benefit more from doing what we did and getting her out of jail as quickly as possible and into a prenatal residential facility where she had a bed and caregivers and support for her and that baby, and where ultimately she gave birth to a healthy baby, and where she stayed sober and she graduated from the program, and where she's now got her own housing when she can continue to be the kind of mother that we all need her to be so that our communities are safe, so the next generation is healthy. We can build safer communities through strategic efforts to decarcerate. I think about that young woman all the time because my own wife is pregnant and due in just over a month from today. I think about what it would mean to be incarcerated for a misdemeanor property crime during a global pandemic, and to know that that pregnancy is high risk, and to have absolutely no power in a jail cell to use alcohol-based hand sanitizers, or to have easy access to showers or other basic hygiene to protect yourself and your unborn child. Jails were not the right answer for that young woman. And all too often across this state, across this country, we're relying on jails for lack of creativity, for lack of access to better alternatives. We must, as a community, we must build those alternatives. And we must demand that elected officials like district attorneys and sheriffs and board of supervisor members and state legislators avail themselves of those alternatives, that we build them, that we invest in them, that we make them successful, that we continue to teach the lesson time and time again that we on this call, on this meeting, know is true, which is that incarceration does not make us safer, that treating root causes of crime makes us safer, that creating good jobs and treatment on demand and safe consumption sites and easy unfettered access to behavioral health services is what makes us safer. Now, I really wish that Trump had followed science the way we did. I think we'd all be in person today if he had done that. And I know at the local level, our efforts in San Francisco made a dramatic impact. We reduced the number of people in our county jail just in the beginning of 2020 by about 40%. We went down from over 1,200 people a day in January of 2020 to the low 700s today. We've stabilized at a number that is far lower and safer than what it was for decades before. We partnered with other areas of local government, other justice partners, to close definitively an entire part of our jail known as County Jail 4. It was a dilapidated and seismically unsafe jail that an earthquake would have brought to the ground, killing everyone in it. And for decades, the city knew that it had to close this jail, but didn't figure out how to decarcerate fast enough or sustainably enough. Well, we did that work. We did it following science. And we did it in a context where overall crime was also falling. Now, this is an important point. It's a reminder that prosecutors have the power to reframe the approach to public safety. All too often, prosecutors and police unions are out there saying, if you let people out of jail, there'll be more crime. And what we saw in San Francisco was the opposite. That as we decreased our reliance on incarceration, crime rates fell. In my first year in office, overall crime in San Francisco fell by about 20%. And the jail population fell by about 40%. In other words, we were able to create a virtuous cycle where we interrupted the damage and the destabilization that incarceration causes to people. We paired people with supervision and with services rather than holding them in jail, forcing them to lose their housing or their jobs or the family support that they needed. And as we heard in the prior speech, people were close to the edge, and if you push them off the edge, sometimes 2 days in jail is enough to do that. It makes all of us less safe. And so we started being really intentional and deliberate about our decisions for who to incarcerate. And in the process, we have made a tremendous impact. So I want to talk about some other areas that we've done that. We talk a lot about jails and prisons. We have an image in our mind of adults, but prosecutors must also include kids and youth in decarceral efforts. Progressive prosecutors must use our discretion to refuse to charge kids as adults. We must reject this fiction that some kids aren't really kids and don't deserve to be treated like kids. I made a commitment to the voters of San Francisco, and it's one that I'm proud to say I've honored, even in the face of tremendous pressure, to refuse to prosecute any children as adults ever. We also have managed to dramatically reduce the number of children that are incarcerated in juvenile hall. We're not doing it by sending them to the adult jail. I want to be clear. I have not, and I will never prosecute a youth as an adult, but we still managed from peak to trough to reduce the number of people in the San Francisco Juvenile Detention Center by 75%. We also thought holistically about keeping families together and strengthening families. And so we were the first county in the state to implement a parental diversion program so that the children of the incarcerated are not punished the way that I and Lorenzo and so many others are across this country because of mistakes their parents have made. In other words, we recognized that we are all safer when parents are at home supporting their children rather than incarcerated and force their kids into foster care. I know from my own experience how devastating parental incarceration can be. And so we prioritize finding ways to keep parents at home, even as we hold them accountable for the harm that they've caused, even as we make sure that there are consequences for those who commit crime. We try to protect the next generation from being punished and from facing those consequences. No one benefits from families being ripped apart, and no one suffers more than the kids who are left behind. And that's one of the reasons I'm so proud of our parental diversion program that has so far in its first year seen well over 100 people participate, most of them more than 90% so far successfully. A lot of what we've talked about so far is focused on the front end, people who get arrested, people who get accused of crimes. And I think it's critical that prosecutors also think full spectrum, that we also look to the back end, right? As we talk about decarceration, it's not just about ending money bail or using non-punitive, non-carceral approaches to low-level offenses, but it also means looking to our state prisons and identifying people who have served enough time and who can safely be released back to their communities. It's for that reason that I formed a post-conviction unit, which, among other things, carefully reviews cases of people who've been in state prison for decades and then considers whether they can successfully re-enter their communities and then ask the court to re-sentence those who can. In my first year in office, we successfully resentenced more than 50 people who had been serving extreme, unnecessarily long sentences. In each case, we worked with family and community to build a strong reentry plan. We presented that plan to the court, and we asked the court to resentence someone to a shorter term of incarceration to allow them to be released immediately. In the process, we found people, including a woman in her 80s who was suffering from a wide range of debilitating medical issues, who'd been in prison about as long as I've been alive. Think about that. A woman in her 80s who's been in prison for a lifetime. What possible public safety benefit is served by continuing to incarcerate that woman? Well, thankfully, she's now back home with her family, with her community. I also ran on a commitment never to seek the death penalty. Now, this doesn't affect a lot of people in San Francisco, and across the state of California right now, there's a temporary moratorium on the death penalty, but the reality is we still have a huge number of people sitting on death row. And when I took office, one of those people had been sentenced to death out of San Francisco County. Not on my watch. We will no longer tinker with the machinery of death in San Francisco County. And I'm proud to say that he's one of the people we resentenced. We got him off death row, effectively ending San Francisco's youth use of the racist, discriminatory, and horrific, inhuman death penalty. We also know that some people serving life in prison, some people on death row across this country are innocent. And so we formed an innocence commission made up of independent experts to review cases of possible wrongful convictions and to make sure that no one is serving time for a crime they did not commit. And of course, we do work every day to improve our policies that in the past have allowed people to be wrongfully convicted. As we think about doing justice, and as we look forward to a better, more humane, more effective justice system, it's equally important that we correct and learn from past mistakes as well. So in addition to this backwards sort of facing work and trying to undo some of the harms of the past, we're also building, as I said, policies going forward to prevent wrongful convictions and to prevent excessive draconian punishments. And one part of that means ending some of the racist policies that have so dominated and defined the criminal legal system. For example, one of my first announcements as district attorney was to create a presumption against using gang enhancements or other status enhancements for sentencing. Look, gang enhancements not only contribute to mass incarceration, but they're fundamentally racist. They criminalize Black and Latinx people in ways that are explicit, not just sort of byproducts of the overall criminal justice system. More than 90% of people in California prisons with gang enhancements are Black or Latinx. We should not be punishing people because of who they are, what neighborhood they grew up in, or who their friends are. We must not continue to perpetuate the racism that exists when we label people as gang members simply because of Instagram photos showing them and their cousins or them and their next door neighbors hanging out in their own neighborhood. Sentencing enhancements, which punish someone because of their past convictions, for which crimes they've already served the time for, are equally problematic. Status-based enhancements, like the 3 strikes law, which we know has disproportionately impacted people of color and has perpetuated mass incarceration and a proliferation of life sentences, including for low-level offenses in many cases. In my administration, we created a presumption against using prior strike enhancements or any status enhancements. In fact, the only way that status-based enhancements can be alleged in our cases is if I personally make an exception to our policy. If I personally say that these facts and circumstances so require. No one should be prosecuted for who they are or who they were many years ago. Now, hand in hand with reducing mass incarceration is ending the criminalization of poverty. During my first few days in office, we made history with the boldest and most progressive bail policy in the nation. We eliminated altogether our office's reliance on money bail at that first court appearance when we're setting the conditions for release in front of a judge. We recognize that there is no relationship whatsoever between the amount of money in your pocket and the risk you pose to public safety. And so we took this system in which wealthy people for decades all across the country, wealthy people, no matter how dangerous, no matter how much risk they pose, have been able to simply buy their way out of jail. Meanwhile, poor people, simply because of their poverty, languish behind bars, even when the arrest is based on trumped up charges, even when there's no evidence against them. It's a system that undermines public safety by putting dangerous people with resources back on the street. And it's a system that also undermines equal protection under law by discriminating based on class in ways that deprive people of the most fundamental of all rights, their liberty. And so we replaced this wealth-based system with a risk-based system. We now ask for detention in those cases where someone presents an unmitigable risk. And we ask for release with appropriate conditions when we believe that the charges and the evidence don't justify holding someone in custody before they've even been convicted of the crime. And we now see prosecutors nationwide moving to follow our lead in places as far away as Chittenden County, Vermont. we've seen offices, entire district attorney offices, follow our lead and stop using money bail. Now, we talk about ending discrimination and ending mass incarceration. Obviously, these are critical core parts of reform, but they're only one piece of the puzzle. For far too long, victims of crime have been left out of the criminal justice reform conversation. They've been used and held out to demand more punitive reforms, but ignored when we talk about reform, ignored when it comes to how we're going to reinvest the money we saved from closing jails and prison. Prosecutors must work to center crime victims and survivors in new ways. We must work to build a culture of healing, not just of punishment. We must work to build a culture of support, not just of punishment. And what that means is listening to survivors and pursuing approaches like restorative justice when they bring healing and accountability, and to provide services that crime victims need. Now, these sorts of issues are really particularly critical when we look at the kinds of communities that are uniquely vulnerable. And we've seen in the past year, all across the country, and certainly here in San Francisco, a series of events that have left our Asian American Pacific Islander communities in tremendous fear of violence, of hate incidents, of hate speech. And there's a critical role for law enforcement to play in condemning any violence or any hateful conduct towards anyone, particularly our most vulnerable. We must find ways to offer support to our AAPI community during a time when they have been unfairly and disproportionately suffering, with racism coming straight out of the White House for much of 2020, with encouraging from the White House to discriminate against our vulnerable Asian American brothers and sisters. Now, I promoted as Chief of Victim Services, a Cantonese-speaking attorney with a long history of victim service advocacy and legal advocacy for victims of crime. We've made hires and created new programs to promote cultural competency and language access for all crime victims. We've more than doubled the number of people on my team that speak Chinese. We want cultural competency, we want linguistic fluency, and we want all victims of crime, regardless of whether or not the people who commit the harm, who cause the harm, commit the crime, are even arrested by police. It's imperative that we not make victim services and supports contingent on criminal prosecution, but rather we recognize that all people who've been harmed by violence, all people who've been harmed by crime, deserve and need our support. And I'm really proud of our historic expansion of our victim services work and our partnership, even at the state level. For example, co-sponsoring a state law that provides new benefits and supports to hate crime victims. Throughout all we've seen in the past 18 months, we've worked hard to make sure that anyone who's vulnerable, anyone who feels unsafe, can begin to feel safe. We've done it in critical ways. For example, we partnered with Lyft and Airbnb to provide safe and discreet transportation and housing to victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. We knew that shelter-in-place orders left those folks particularly vulnerable with nowhere to go, no way to escape abusers. And so we helped provide a way to escape places of danger and get to places of safety. We also recognize that during the pandemic, with so much commerce and tourism shut down, our small businesses were particularly vulnerable. And so we launched a pilot program with one of our districts to compensate small businesses that experienced broken glass or other kinds of vandalism to help pay for the insurance deductible to repair their windows or the damage. And we're now hoping that we can expand that successful pilot program all across the city and county of San Francisco. We also worked with other government agencies like our medical examiner's office to pilot a program to expand toxicology testing for victims of sexual assault to better enable us to gather evidence after these horrific attacks occur. And we recently launched a program to help people who are worried that someone they know might use a gun to obtain gun violence restraining orders. We've secured a significant grant to center crime victims and to use restorative justice approaches when victims so request and prefer. We also know that all too often, the system ignores or defines victims in ways that are really narrow, that ignore, for example, victims of police violence and don't treat them as victims. I created a policy after the murder of George Floyd to compensate and support victims of police violence like any other victim of violence, even when police reports don't list the person shot or injured as a victim, right? In other words, we know that all too often people of color are victims of police violence, but are totally cut off from state benefits and services because the police report lists them as a suspect, not as a victim. So in my office, we believe that no one should have to create a GoFundMe page just to bury a loved one, especially if that loved one was killed by someone wearing a uniform and armed by the state. Our policy, which was created in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, is now a model for state legislation. It's Senate Bill number 299, which would provide and require that the State Victims Compensation Board provide benefits to victims of police violence. Now, as we talk about trying to find ways to support victims and victims of police violence, we also need to remember to use our power to enforce laws equally. And that means that, equal justice under law, equal enforcement of the law. That means that regardless of whether someone wears a uniform to work, wears a star on their lapel, whether they're the CEO of a billion-dollar company, if they commit a crime, they're not above the law. It means finding ways to proactively stop racial profiling and ending racial disparities. It means protecting workers and combating corruption that harms us all. So let me talk briefly about some of our work in this space. Police accountability. The tragic killings of so many people of color at the hands of police catalyzed a national movement unlike anything that we've ever seen. And I think many of us were driven to the streets, fueled by righteous rage at the unequal and racist treatment of Black people in our system. And we were looking for ways to turn that righteous rage, the energy we saw in the streets, into concrete policies. Well, we started doing that here in San Francisco. We acted quickly to implement changes and to ensure that we would hold anyone who committed a crime, including police officers, accountable. For example, we co-sponsored a resolution to call on the city to refuse to hire officers from another jurisdiction with a documented history of misconduct for things like racial bias, excessive force, or perjury. We created a policy in my office to refuse to prosecute cases that rest on the uncorroborated word of officers with a known history of misconduct. And my lawyers are not allowed to file cases alleging charges like resisting arrest or assault on an officer unless they first review all available body camera footage to ensure the charges are not fabricated to cover up for excessive use of force. And we joined other progressive district attorneys across the state to call on the California Bar Association to prevent prosecutors from taking money from police unions so that they do not face the conflict of interest in deciding whether or not to prosecute officers who are members of those same unions that financed their election. There's now a state law that would also similarly force, based on our efforts, that would force prosecutors who choose to accept direct financial and political support from police unions to recuse themselves and not take control over the decision whether or not to prosecute members of those same unions. Police unions should not get to buy control over who does and who does not get held accountable when a crime occurs. These policies are great, but they're not enough. We also have to take action. We have to take action in individual cases, including when individual officers break the sacred trust that we as a society place in them. Prosecutors have the power to use their discretion, and it's for decades, for centuries, that discretion has been used as a one-way street to excuse and justify over-policing of Black and brown communities, instead of to also hold those in power accountable. So we started making changes. We've bolstered my office's independent investigation bureau, which has filed numerous historic cases against law enforcement officers for excessive force. For example, we filed the first ever homicide charges against an on-duty San Francisco police officer for killing an unarmed Black man. We presented to a grand jury another case involving use of force by an officer in which an officer shot a man after he was already lying on the ground, unarmed and bleeding from prior gunshot wounds. We're also prosecuting an officer who beat a Black man with a baton breaking multiple bones when that officer had not seen him commit any crime or do anything wrong. And we're also prosecuting 2 sheriff's deputies for a brutal beating of a man who was also unarmed. In my administration, no one is above the law. Now, a commitment to equal justice demands that prosecutors be leaders in the quest for racial justice. Historically, prosecutors and their offices far too often have perpetuated and amplified racial inequalities. And rarely, if ever, have we seen district attorneys' offices embrace the battle for racial justice. Our legal system remains plagued by racial inequities, and it is burdened by the deeply ingrained racism that permeates nearly every aspect of our society. Prosecutors are uniquely positioned to respond to this call to action in meaningful ways. Prosecutors must develop systems to ensure that our charging decisions are not influenced by implicit bias or explicit bias. And we must work to make sure that we are actively dismantling systems that have led to the disproportionately punitive outcomes for people of color. These systems are so deeply ingrained that they can often be hard to identify or track, but it's important work for us to undertake and to do it systematically and on a daily basis as part of our job. I'm proud that in California, we passed the Racial Justice Act to provide concrete tools to combat racial inequities. One of my first policies was to refuse to file contraband cases stemming from racist pretextual stops. No one should be pulled over for driving while Black or brown. And as prosecutors, we must call out that racism when we see it and refuse to sanction it. We're also working to establish a Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission to reckon with the legacy of harmful police practices and racial discrimination in our communities. It was an idea that I launched in partnership with other progressive prosecutors across the country, and I'm proud we've identified and selected and have now handed the baton to a Black-led community-based organization here in the Bay Area, the Haywood Burns Institute, to take the lead on that Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission. Fighting systemic racial inequalities means working to hire and promote people of color. In addition to the work that we're doing around specific policies impacting people who are system impacted, we're also hiring and promoting people of color, putting them in key positions in the office. We have, and I created this position, an officer in my department whose responsibility is to help with hiring, promotion, training, as well as culture, and as well as ensuring that we're fostering the kinds of values that reflect the community that we serve. Many of my staff, most in fact, have voluntarily taken a racial justice pledge. It's a small thing, but it's something that reminds us every day of our duty to promote racial justice, something that sadly prosecutors have overlooked or often done worse than that, often been complicit with the systems that perpetuate racial inequity. These are just a few examples that can demonstrate the broad powers of prosecutors, not only to work to end racial injustice, but to actively promote changing the direction of our justice system. I know that my office and prosecutors nationwide have a long way to go before we in the communities we serve can recognize the promise of equal justice under law. One of the other areas that needs a lot of work when it comes to equal justice is ending corruption. Corporations and politicians should not be allowed to break the rules simply because of their power, their privilege, or their wealth. For that reason, I started a workers' rights unit in our office to protect workers from exploitation and wage theft. Crimes against workers lead to many interconnected problems in our communities that undermine public safety. And so finding ways to protect workers helps protect public safety. Our unit prosecutes cases like wage theft, worker misclassification, labor trafficking, and other areas of enforcement of the labor code. Last year, this team brought a historic civil enforcement lawsuit against DoorDash for worker misclassification in a case that impacts as many as 300,000 potential victims. We also filed an action against Handy for misclassifying its workers, disproportionately women of color who are put into vulnerable positions every single day on the job. This unit is leading the way in working to promote and protect the most vulnerable employees, those who are especially at risk during the pandemic. Now, I know there's a lot more we could say about corruption, and of course, we could spend hours talking about all of the challenges that we are facing. But I want to make sure to save time for question and answer. I want to make sure that I can address the specific concerns and questions that all of you have in the work you do and the ideas that you may have for how I and my office can do better. So let me wrap up simply by acknowledging that there is no way in a single year, much less in a single half an hour presentation, our office could have addressed all of the ways in which the criminal justice system is crying out for reform. We must continue to fight. We have a lot of work ahead of us. We must do more for crime victims and survivors. We must build trust between communities that are impacted by crime and law enforcement agencies that serve and protect those communities. We must find ways to reinvest the savings from decarceration in the kind of community programming that prevents crime in the first place. And we must continue to work to remove the taint of racism that still lingers in every courthouse in this nation. And I want to encourage everyone here today, as we continue throughout this amazing conference, to remember to think boldly and bravely. I know that the accomplishments that I've highlighted today during a time of historic obstacles serves as a reminder that with every single challenge, there are also opportunities for us to reevaluate our approaches and think about how we can accelerate long overdue change. We have so much more to do, and there is so much in our nation and in the world that must change. And together we can confront the many obstacles that we are facing. And we can find on the other side of those obstacles some tremendous opportunities for progress. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Chesa, for starting the conversation and giving us a variety of ways we can begin to rethink public safety and make transformative and much needed change. And I want to thank you for talking about centering all victims and ensuring that victims of police violence are acknowledged and supported. Many times we see that someone who is a quote unquote known gang member is seen as a threat simply based on that label. And their killings are justified when they're shot down by police officers and sheriff deputies. And San Diego, unfortunately, has a lot of those stories. So just by simply implementing policies like that you talked about, which honors justice for all victims, really does make an impact, even in the area of how we prosecute what we call gang crimes or things that are just gang related. So I'm going to go to the first question that I have, because I think that what you talked about as far as disparities in the criminal legal system is a very critical starting point for us. One thing I believe is often missing from our conversations about criminal justice reform is the nexus between how certain communities are policed and what plays out in the courtroom. So there have been reports that have shed light on racial bias in policing, namely racial profiling by way of pretextual stops in San Francisco. Similar to San Diego and certainly other jurisdictions, it was found that African Americans were pulled over in traffic stops in San Francisco well out of proportion with their representation in the driving population. To be exact, 5 times more than any other demographic. So in response to this very clear evidence of racial bias in policing, you implemented policies and you have very strong language. You said that you wanted to send a message loud and clear to the police department and to communities of color that we will no longer participate in, condone, tolerate, or amplify racist police tactics. And you told us about why addressing racial disparities in our criminal legal system was a priority for you, but can you briefly touch on what policies you implemented?
Absolutely, and I did cover a few of them at a high level, but let me go in a little more detail and talk about the one you just mentioned with regard to the pretextual traffic stops. San Francisco has for decades been the jurisdiction in the country with the worst, or at least in the state, with the worst, most disparate traffic stops targeting Black and brown drivers. it's not like it's a new thing. It's not like it just happened today. For 20 years, you can go back and look at studies by the ACLU, by the Obama Department of Justice, by any group, by traffic safety groups, you name it. And what they find is that in San Francisco, police are stopping Black and brown motorists. They're doing it in numbers that are horrifically disproportionate. And those stops, in some cases, like we saw in Brooklyn, Minnesota, can lead to young people getting shot and killed by police. In some cases, they lead to searches or to other kinds of invasive interactions that undermine trust in the community in law enforcement. And when they use those stops to justify a search, and then those searches result in criminal charges for contraband, we end up leading to a situation where people, as Sean was talking about earlier, people don't want to talk to police. They don't want to rely on police to solve problems that are happening in their community. And so if we're going to build trust, if we're going to find ways to actually serve the communities that we've sworn to serve and protect, then it has to start with ensuring we have equal enforcement of the law. And, the 2016 Obama Department of Justice report highlighted this issue, pretextual traffic stops for the San Francisco Police Department. And it issued a report with hundreds of recommended policy changes. When I took office 4 years later, only about 5% of those changes had been implemented, right? And so it was simply not enough for me to sit back and wait for the police department to reform itself. It was not enough for me to say, well, we know this is a problem, but not our problem. No, it is our problem. When we prosecute the cases they bring us, we have to pierce the veil. We have to look at whether or not those cases were generated through racist practices that undermine public safety rather than promote it. And so in Black History Month, about a month after I took office, we announced this policy that is going to accelerate and push the police department to make the changes in culture and policy that are long overdue. And it's a simple thing. It says, if you conduct a pretextual traffic stop and use that as a basis to conduct a search, we're not going to file the charges unless there's some extraordinary circumstance, right? We don't want police to stop every Black and brown person who's driving through our communities. We want police to enforce laws equally. If they see a crime, great, we'll prosecute it. But if you're simply using someone's skin color as a basis to initiate interactions that then can cause trauma, can lead to violence, can cause people to lose their jobs, have their cars towed, that's destructive, it's not productive. And we're not going to be in our office, in my office, on my watch, we're not going to be complicit in that, not anymore.
Do you think that ending gang prosecutions will change police behavior on the streets? In other words, if we don't need to build book for gang prosecutions, will that change the type of stop and frisk type of policing that we're seeing, or the pretextual stops based on someone looking like a gang member, for instance?
That's certainly one of the hopes is that we can change the culture of policing and of the interactions between communities and law enforcement. I know that any change is hard and cultural change takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. The old saying is that culture eats policy for dinner. And so having new policies is really important, but we also need to make sure that we're thinking intentionally and proactively about how we change culture. Now, that's something that's a lot easier for us to do in my office. As I said, we hired a queer woman of color immigrant to lead our team that focuses on culture in the office, that focuses on recruiting and retaining and training. So we're doing that work proactively in the office. But the police department, I don't control their policies, much less their culture. And so we're doing what we can to push that department in the right direction through the kinds of policies and practices we discussed today. But I know it's going to take time. I know it starts with the academy. If you look at the way that police academies work in this state, they spend about 10 hours over a 6-month academy on de-escalation. And they spend about 10 times that on firearms, right? And so we need to look at where our priorities are, where we're training people, what the culture is that officers have on day one when they hit the streets. And that's going to take a long time. But these policies are a critical part of that change, for sure.
Chesa, I know you're a member of the Prosecutors Alliance of California. For the edification of our attendees, can you tell us a little more about this group and what you all do? And then I'll come with a follow-up question. I don't want to assume folks in the room know what the Prosecutors Alliance of California is.
Absolutely. So the Prosecutors Alliance is a new group I was proud to be a founding member of. We represent about a third of the people of the state of California, Los Angeles County, San Joaquin County, Contra Costa County, and San Francisco County. And we are a group of prosecutors who are committed to reform, who recognize that public safety requires new approaches, requires approaches based in data, based in community empowerment, and based on reducing our reliance on incarceration. And we do everything from trainings for for prosecutors around the state to legislative advocacy. I started this morning at 8 a.m. on a call with an assembly member to talk about some of the bills that we're supporting, including that bill that I mentioned that would provide victim services to families of those killed by police. So, that's an example of what we do. It's about trying to accelerate the change that we're each working to implement in our own offices at the state level, and through sharing policy ideas, practices, resources, training materials, and coming together to have a stronger unified voice about the need for the kinds of reforms we're talking about here today.
So as a member of the Prosecutors Alliance of California, I'm sure you've paid attention to the Racial Justice Act, which took effect this year. I'm wondering how this new law has impacted your prosecutions and the policies, practices, and even programs in your district attorney office. For instance, did you offer any new training for your deputies or launch a new unit in response to it? And can you speak to the importance of legislation that seeks to address racial disparities in the courtroom?
Yeah, I was a supporter of the Racial Justice Act. Assemblymember Ash Kalra, who was one of the sponsors, is a colleague and friend, and I think he's done really critically important work at the state level in helping to promote and push new laws that help us in the courtrooms do justice, and move away from the shameful history we've talked about. We have done trainings on it, and the main way that we're seeing it affect us so far is in the kind of discovery and evidence that we're providing to defense lawyers. We're getting a lot of requests for data, and we are working to get staff specifically to work on providing that data and doing more work to be able to more quickly respond to requests we get under the Racial Justice Act. Thankfully, in many ways, our policies were already ahead of the curve in San Francisco. And so I think the impact of that law is going to be greater in those counties that have been resisting change, rather than like here in San Francisco, where we've been embracing it and accelerating it. So I think there's a critical role. In an ideal world, you elect officials who can make that change on their own in their own offices as district attorneys. But when you have people who refuse to do that, implementing state laws that require them to and force them to, such as the Racial Justice Act, is a critical step. And it helps to ensure that the kinds of changes we're talking about aren't limited to just one administration or one elected district attorney, but that they can spread across the state and transcend me and my office and whoever comes next.
All right, so we have just under a minute before we hit 10 o'clock. So I want to make sure that we get at least 2 more questions in that should be pretty simple to answer, probably not simple, but won't take a lot of words. One of our attendees has asked, is risk calculated with Compass or determined some other way? And I think this was in relation to what you talked about regarding the ending of the use of bail.
We do not. So the Compass assessment is used by the probation department. That's not something that I have any control over. And that's something that happens after the fact, not at the pretrial stage. Our courts here in San Francisco do use a risk assessment algorithm. It's called the PSA. It was produced by the Arnold Foundation. Again, that's not something that I or my office have direct control over. We do see a copy of that risk assessment. It is one factor among many that we consider, but it is not in any way binding on the court or on my staff. And we look at the law, we look at the criminal history, we look at the strength of the case, the non-monetary alternatives that are available for pretrial release, and we make a decision based on all of those factors in every case. So we are not simply or blindly relying on an algorithm to make these decisions. I don't think that's appropriate. I think there's perhaps a role for risk assessment algorithms to play, but I am acutely aware of all of the different ways in which those algorithms can compound racial biases that exist within the criminal justice system, and then repackage them as race neutral. And that's really problematic, and we need to be intentional and really transparent with the public about what these tools do and what they don't do. So we have them because our court requires them, and my assistant district attorneys look at them as one of dozens of factors that they consider before making a detention or release decision.
Thank you. And finally, you heard the state of the movement by Sean Garcia Lays, and certainly you know firsthand the pushback against criminal justice reform. Can you tell us how fragile the progress is that we've made?
You know, we're making tremendous progress. We're seeing gains across the country, up and down the state of California, and we're also seeing a backlash, a fierce backlash. I'm currently facing not one, but two separate recalls. They're spending about $15,000 a day, every single day, gathering signatures, buying signatures, spreading lies, undermining the progress that we're making, fear-mongering, exploiting tragedies to try and roll back racial justice reforms. That's what we're up against. We're up against police unions. We're up against corporate billionaires who do not want to see their power and their privilege eroded, folks who are absolutely dedicated and will stop at nothing to spread fear and lies, to tell people that if crime occurs, it's because of criminal justice reform, rather than because of the failings of mass incarceration, who will tell people that if we let folks out of jail, crime is going to go up, who will tell people that the only way to be safe is to send young Black and brown men into cages. We know that's not true, but we have to continue to fight. We have to keep the pressure up. It is fragile. It is delicate. This is a movement that has tremendous energy, but it also is facing unprecedented headwinds and challenges in the form of the pushback from police unions and corporate billionaires. So we need your help. We need you to stay engaged in developing good ideas on the ground, in helping to support folks who are doing the work that reflects your values, and in helping to push back on social media, on Nextdoor and Twitter, on your local TV stations when you hear lies and fear-mongering. We need you to be a voice of reason and calm and thinking always about the long-term safety and well-being of our communities.
Thank you so much again, DA Boudin. If we can all just give him a round of applause, either virtually or while on mute, he can still see the applause. But we just want to thank you again for starting the conversation, and you're exactly right. And this is the entire purpose of this convening, so we can come together and begin to do the rethinking and the strategizing and the movement building that we need to get us to the place that we need to be in. So thank you so very much again. Thank you.
Thank you all. Really appreciate you and appreciate the opportunity to share a little of what we're doing. Come visit us up in San Francisco.
Indeed, we will. So everyone, I did put the links in for today's 10 a.m. session.